Sergio, thank you very much for that address and for flying all the way in from Brussels. And thank you to our other guests who have flown in for this conference. A number of us actually met at Yale. That was the first time we met, Jonathan and Richard, a few years ago, at a fantastic conference that Bonnie had organized. And so it's wonderful to be back together. Relationships really, really do matter. And to have this group who are really dedicated to ending violent conflict and have such experience of doing so. And I can think of no better people, no more experienced people than our panel to comment on Sergio's address. We have Jonathan Powell, who is the head of Intermediate. He was Chief of Staff to Tony Blair from 1997 to 2007, and the Chief British Government Negotiator on Northern Ireland during that time. And I really recommend his books. He has written Great Hatred, Little Room, Negotiating Peace in Northern Ireland, and The New Machiavelli, How to Wield Power in the Modern World. We have Rory Montgomery, who's a former Irish diplomat who served as permanent representative to the EU, ambassador to France, and second Secretary General at the departments of the Taoiseach and Foreign Affairs, with particular responsibility for Brexit. Well, that went well. And he was part of the Irish team which negotiated the Good Friday Agreement. And joining us virtually is Niall O'Dowd, who's the founder of Irish Central, Irish America magazine, and the Irish Voice newspaper, and was deeply involved in the peace process in Northern Ireland. So Jonathan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Emma, and thank you to you and to Bonnie and to Hira for organizing this session, which I think is very timely. We have the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement coming up next year, and already people are making TV documentaries and even one feature film to celebrate that. And I think particularly, as Sergio touched on, in the context of what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Ethiopia, and a number of other conflicts where there will have to be negotiated settlements, it is worth pondering what lessons could be drawn from virtually the only two successful peace agreements in the last few decades. So I think it's very well worth doing. And it's a great pleasure to be doing it with Sergio, a very close friend of mine and a colleague who's demonstrated both his intellect and actually his courage in bringing about peace in Northern Ireland, standing up for it and really pushing it through. So it's a wonderful thing to be sitting with Sergio. And we work together, as he said, very closely on a number of peace processes around the world. It is interesting how each successful peace process learns from the previous one. In Northern Ireland, all of the parties went to South Africa, were taken there and toured and talked to people. One of the advantages of that is that parties who can't talk to each other in place in Northern Ireland, for example, Sinn Féin and the Unionists, were able to do so when they were in South Africa, as well as learning jointly the lessons from what had happened there. Then Colombia learning from Northern Ireland, and now the number of Burmese generals and others we've taken to Colombia and to Northern Ireland, not successfully in the case of Burma, sadly, of Myanmar, but it is really worth trying to see if one can learn from previous peace processes. And what Sergio and President Santos did, I thought very sensibly, was to set up a little advisory group to help them, with a guerrilla leader from El Salvador, Joaquim Villalobos, with Rory from Harvard, with me, and with others, including a former Israeli foreign minister at the time of Camp David, people with very different experiences of peace negotiations, to try and draw from the lessons they had learned. Because if you're going to make mistakes in a peace process, you might as well at least make some new ones, not just repeat the ones from the previous peace processes. And that's what we tried to do. As I say, I think it's really worth looking at that today. And I hope if we end today with some thoughts on what we can take away from Northern Ireland and from Colombia for the conflicts in Ukraine, Ethiopia, and elsewhere. What can they learn from the negotiations, the mistakes we made, and the successes for what will have to be negotiations in the end. It's all very well Boris Johnson saying there will be no negotiations in Ukraine. It's not actually up to him. It's up to the Ukrainian government. And as President Zelensky has said, all conflicts do end in the end with a negotiation of one sort or another. I'm not going to try and replicate Sergio's 10 commandments, with which I totally agree for negotiators. And I'd written down a list of 26 lessons to be learned from Colombia and Northern Ireland, which I shall spare you from in my 5 minutes. But let me just touch on a couple of others that I think could be useful. One is that really came home to me as a sort of very traditional sort of Brit diplomat, was the importance of having an inclusive negotiation. That we had tried repeatedly in Northern Ireland to get to peace without being inclusive. Sunningdale, we did not have Sinn Féin, we did not actually have the loyalists in Sunningdale either, who brought down the Sunningdale Agreement. The Anglo-Irish Agreement was between the two governments. It didn't involve the parties, it specifically excluded the parties. Downing Street Declaration failed again to bring in the parties. So the reason the Good Friday Agreement succeeded in the end, with all sorts of reasons, but one of them was it was inclusive. We did have Sinn Féin, we did have the loyalists. And I think that is true of everywhere. You need to be prepared to talk to the men with guns. That's what they learned in Colombia. And I think it's something we have to learn again, even with some of the Islamist groups we face around the world. Admittedly, a controversial statement, although we now have, of course, negotiated with the Taliban as well as other groups around the world. But I do think that point that you need to be willing to talk to the men with guns and not just think that you can win militarily is one of the important lessons I take from both negotiations. The second, I think, is the importance of process. Shimon Peres had a very good way of summing this up, the former Israeli president and the master of the one-liner. He said, the thing about peace negotiations is, in the case of the Middle East, we know what the outcome will be in terms of territory, more or less in terms of Jerusalem and in terms of refugees, but we don't have a process to get there. He said, the good news is there's light at the end of the tunnel. The bad news is there's no tunnel. And that's what you're trying to do in a peace process, what Sergio was trying to do in Colombia, what we were trying to do in Northern Ireland was construct that tunnel. Actually prepare, don't try and rush in. When I work with many governments, what they want to do is rush straight away, not to bother about process. Let's just agree a ceasefire, and then let's hope the whole thing holds. And it doesn't work. Almost always when you do that, it collapses because there is no basis for the negotiation. What Sergio spent 6 months doing in Colombia, well, in Havana, secretly, was negotiating that basic agreement. And that was fundamental to the success of the negotiations, as was, I think, the heads of agreement we had in Northern Ireland. So having a process is really important, and making sure that process doesn't fall over. I think of it as a bicycle theory, to mix my metaphors, that if you want to get the bicycle moving, you do not want to let it fall over. A number of times in the Northern Ireland peace process, it nearly collapsed. A number of times in Colombia, things came very close. One stage in the secret negotiations, Sergio threatened to walk out, packed his bags and was ready to go, to get the FARC to focus on the need to include weapons in the agenda for the negotiations. So I think keeping that bicycle moving, making sure that no one walks out is fundamental. So secondly, a process I think is absolutely crucial. I think the third lesson I would take is an interesting example of different lessons to draw from Northern Ireland and Colombia. Not all the lessons you draw are just linear. It's not just similarities between the negotiations. It's lessons you can learn of doing things in different ways on the same issue. So in Northern Ireland, we could not have had fighting and talking. President Santos deliberately did not want to have a ceasefire for his negotiations with the FARC because of the lessons from Caguan, where giving them a whole chunk of the country the size of Switzerland led to them coming back into the war with more power and not negotiating seriously at the time. So he was determined to have the fighting and talking, to keep the military pressure on them and to try and get to an agreement. We could not have done that in Northern Ireland. Politically, it would have been impossible to negotiate with the IRA, with Sinn Féin, if the violence was continuing. When they killed two soldiers immediately after, two policemen immediately after we came into office, we did send a message to Sinn Féin saying that if there were any more killings, they would not be included. IRA carried on killing, they would not be in the talks, and we would intended to be in power for a long time, so they would find themselves frozen out for a long time. They then moved to make sure that they could get to a ceasefire and we could have such negotiations. So that two different circumstances, but addressing the same problem. And you have to think about the problem because you'll always run into those similar sort of problems as you go along. And as you run into those blockages, you always need to have thoughts of how to get out of the blockages in those negotiations, because you will inevitably get yourself into a situation where you get into a gridlock. I think in the case of Northern Ireland, the most obvious lesson from that is what we call constructive ambiguity. In the Good Friday Agreement, we deliberately had language on weapons, what had happened to the IRA weapons, that was ambiguous. We sat there 3 days and 3 nights to get to the Good Friday Agreement without sleep, but it would have taken 3 years without sleep to have got to a solution of the problem of weapons. But by putting language in that was ambiguous, we stored up a problem for ourselves later on. The agreement began to lose support, particularly amongst unionists. So by 2003, support was down to about 1/3 of the unionist community for the Good Friday Agreement. We had to drive that ambiguity out of the agreement. Tony Blair confronted the IRA with choosing between the ballot box and the Armalite, and that was the stage they started decommissioning in response to a request from Gerry Adams, and we got into the final stage of those negotiations. And lastly, choreography and sequencing that Sergio touched on. Some of these lessons are quite technical that you can draw from the negotiations. People think that if you just sign an agreement with all the basic elements in it, it will be fine. Sergio referred to the Minsk agreement of 2014 between the Ukrainian government and the Russian government. The elements in the Minsk agreement are perfectly unobjectionable: a ceasefire, a degree of autonomy, elections. But the Russians managed to sneak into it a sequence that was unachievable for the Ukrainian government. No democratically elected Ukrainian government could follow that sequence of steps in implementing the agreement. So it's incredibly important to think about, when you have an agreement, the way it will be implemented. In Northern Ireland, our problem was the standoff about weapons. The IRA didn't want to give up their weapons till the Unionists really shared power with them. The Unionists didn't want to share power with a political party that had a private army behind it. Both reasonable positions. What we had to do is break it down into baby steps, little tiny steps, and then get each side to agree on what those steps should be. What Sergio did was, with DDR, agreed a very clear sequence of steps that would happen step by step in conjunction with the political steps that needed to happen. That's what a peace agreement really is about, because people don't trust each other when they sign a piece of paper. Piece of paper that they have because they don't trust each other. It's, as I think we'll discuss in the next session, it's the implementation that is the only thing that builds trust, and that's what you need to think about. There's one last thought that I would touch on, which is that you also need a great deal of ingenuity in both negotiations to bring them to conclusion. In Northern Ireland, we finally got Ian Paisley of the DUP and Gerry Adams of Sinn Féin to agree that they would implement the St Andrews Agreement. They agreed that they would meet. They agreed they would meet on television. They agreed that what they would say. They agreed how long the meeting would last. But we could not get them to agree where they would sit. Ian Paisley did not want to sit next to Gerry Adams and look like he was a friend of this terrorist. Gerry Adams did not want to sit opposite Paisley and look like an inferior being talked down to by Ian Paisley. And we were completely stuck. A very bright Northern Ireland official came up with an inspired idea of a new shape of table, diamond-shaped table with an apex, where they could sit next to each other and opposite each other at the same time. And that overcame the problem. They agreed to the meeting and actually did implement it until the latest government tried to screw it up. We can discuss that later. So in conclusion, I would say that what I learned from Colombia and from Northern Ireland, and I think is really important to what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Ethiopia and so many other places, is that there isn't such a thing as an insoluble conflict. People will tell you they're insoluble all the way until you sign a peace agreement, and then it's inevitable there was going to be a peace agreement. It was always going to happen for economic reasons, because Islamist terrorism had replaced the old-fashioned terrorism of the IRA. Both are untrue. There is no conflict that is insoluble, but it's not inevitable that any of them will be solved. You have to find leaders with the courage to take risks, to have the patience to implement an agreement, and most of all, who can learn the lessons from what happened before. And that's why I think this initiative is so important, to try and encapsulate some of those lessons, to provide a toolkit of the sort that Sergio describes that can be deployed by future leaders, actually current leaders in Ukraine and Russia, and current leaders in Ethiopia and elsewhere, to implement those steps and get to peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Rory.
Thank you very much indeed, Emma. And delighted to be here at Yale, thanks to Bonnie and Hira and all else, everybody else. Thanks to those of you who are present, and thanks indeed to fellow panelists. There are indeed a range of Irish-Colombian direct connections, as has been mentioned. Eamon Gilmore, who was the boss of Fergal Mythen here, and myself as Minister for Foreign Affairs, EU envoy. There was also perhaps also a less glorious connection in that 3 IRA men were arrested in Colombia, allegedly while bird watching in the territory of the FARC, and giving advice on military matters. But Ireland has followed Colombia very closely, and indeed Colombia, I think I'm right in saying, is the third embassy that we opened in Latin America a few years ago, in South America rather, because precisely of our interest in the peace process. I was going to, in a very extraordinarily summary way, mention sort of 5 things about our process. 5 things which, if you like, focus on complexity, obscurity, and even flaws, not with a view to be negative, but simply to underscore the point that these things are not in any way easy. But I'm going to conclude on a note of sort of qualified optimism, if you like. My first point is that people talk about the Irish peace process, but the reality is, as was mentioned earlier, you had in fact a couple of very different streams which converged eventually. You had a stream of negotiation among constitutional parties, as they were called, those not affiliated with paramilitarism, and the 2 governments. You can trace the origins back even to the 1980s of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Before that, to Sunningdale. There was a talks process in the early 90s where the concepts of the strands of relationships within Northern Ireland, North and South, East and West were developed. So this is where constitutional issues and institutional issues were at the heart. And then you separately, or largely separately, had a process of persuading those who were involved in paramilitary violence to end it. Now, these 2 streams eventually did flow together, but the reality was that different actors in the process were much more interested in some bits of it than others, and much more engaged in some bits of it than others, and perhaps had different expectations of what might be achieved, had different priorities. That's the first point. Second point, a long process. It is a long process, but also a short process. It is a long process because many of the issues had been there for a long time. There had been previous attempts to solve them. There was a painstaking process of building up, doing the homework that was necessary. The Downing Street Declaration was mentioned in December 1993. Framework documents set out in an elaborate way in February of 95, possible structures. Then you had the propositions and heads of agreement, which boiled all of this down in January of 98. So it was a gradual process, but also a very quick process, because the final negotiations, in my memory, were utterly chaotic, and they happened in about 2 or 3 weeks. The 2 governments around St. Patrick's Day, it would have been 17th of March, started putting bits of paper on the table, worked out paper, and building on building to, but also adding to some of the work mentioned earlier. And in the fog of war, I think it's fair to say that probably nobody was fully aware at all times of what was going on. There were different conversations in different places. Some were of fundamental importance, the conversations between Tony Blair, Bernie Ahern, Sinn Féin, and the Unionists, but there were other parts of the forest, there were other things happening. And one of the consequences of this was that when the agreement was finally sort of cobbled together, the various bits were finally knitted together literally on the morning of the 10th of April, that I think many bits had essentially not been scrutinized very carefully, and came as something of a surprise perhaps to some of the participants. And 2 examples, even though the broad constitutional principles around consent and self-determination had been largely agreed and accepted a good bit earlier, there was absolutely no attention paid to the mechanics of a referendum in Northern Ireland, for example, a topic which becomes important now. Or alternatively, on policing, there was a very substantial program of policing reform. Chris Patton was asked, when the Unionists reacted negatively to his report on policing, well, what did they think they were signing up to? And the answer really is they didn't actually know what they were signing up to. They only really realized later on. Would it have been possible to reach an agreement if every line had been gone through meticulously? Of course not. Of course not. And in a way, people sometimes come to me and say, well, what exactly was meant by this or that?
Yeah.
And I will say, well, to be honest, nobody really knew. I mean, things were written down quickly and then stuck. On structures, then, you had, if you like, the dignified part of the process. You had a structure with rules of procedure, a plenary, very effectively chaired by George Mitchell. This was the public face, if you like, of the negotiations, and Mitchell's eloquence and clear good faith and wisdom, I think really kept persuading the public that this was a process which was important and had a chance of working. On the other hand, the real action really occurred elsewhere, and it occurred in small groups and between a small number of participants. So therefore, what was agreed about the governance of Northern Ireland was effectively worked out between two parties, the UUP and the SDLP. What happened on decommissioning and prisoners was for Sinn Féin, British and Irish governments. What happened about North-South was a mixture of the British, the Irish, and the Unionists, etc. And of course, the external factors, the US was mentioned, clearly very important as well. What was really vital was a very close relationship between the two governments, built up over years. And of course, time passes and people move on. But to be honest, it's close to tragic to see the current breakdown of relationships between the two governments. And even though I'm Irish, I don't think I'm being biased in saying that the fault lies pretty well overwhelmingly on the side of the present British government. And fourth point, when you look back at it, interesting that some issues absorbed a huge amount of attention, perhaps almost in some ways at times disproportionate to their later significance. For example, the precise design of North-South structures, hugely important politically in getting the deal done. In terms of their actual consequential impact, you'd have to ask the question. Decommissioning attracted an enormous amount of attention and discussion all the way through the process. On the other hand, little or nothing of substance is said in the agreement about victims, about legacy, about anti-sectarianism, about reconciliation. And I think there were two reasons for this. I think, first of all, there was an assumption that once you had an end to violence and once you had representatives of the two communities working together in government, the rest would kind of follow. And I think we now know that that's not the case. And secondly, to be frank, among the elite negotiators, we didn't actually have the sandwich, really, that Sergio referred to. This was really an elite and political process. And I think there was a view that these issues were somehow soft issues, and they weren't at the nub of things. And as I say, they were for civil society, but civil society was not really engaged in a meaningful way in our process. Final point, I suppose, is that, and this is really important, Jonathan talked about an inclusive process, but of course, it was not a fully inclusive process because Sinn Féin were excluded. The talks began in June of 1996, didn't make a lot of progress until closer to the end and after the new British government came and the new Irish government came in. Bertie Ahern became Taoiseach within a month of Tony Blair becoming Prime Minister and lasted, in fact, just a little bit longer, even 2008. But of course, the Democratic Unionist Party, Ian Paisley's party, walked out of the talks when Sinn Féin came in. So it meant that unionist ambivalence about the whole process was there from the beginning. And there, I think, was always, and you see this even to this day, in a very large section of that community, a real doubt about some of the fundamental principles, a disquiet about the consequences. David Trimble, in my view, is really the unsung hero of the peace process. One thing Sergio didn't mention was the quality of political leadership. We had tremendous leaders across the board. Trimble was a difficult person in many ways. He was not a natural politician, but he had courage politically and a strategic vision. And one of the big questions for me is always this: could more have been done to save him and the Ulster Unionist Party? I don't know.
God knows we tried.
You tried, exactly. We tried. So, in other words, we were dealing with a process, though, in which one of the actors, major actors, at that time, parties representing a majority of the population of Northern Ireland, in the case, were much less enthusiastic about the entire thing than were nationalists or the two governments. However, optimistic note, the Institute of Irish Studies in the University of Liverpool produced a very lengthy opinion survey just earlier this month, and much of it is about the upcoming elections. But it was interesting. the public was asked questions about their view about how things had changed and developed since the Good Friday Agreement. And the balance sheet actually is largely positive. And secondly, the responses were very similar among unionists, among nationalists, and among those who define themselves, a growing number, like 20% now, as neither unionist nor nationalist. And I think this is something people from outside Northern Ireland perhaps don't fully appreciate. But various propositions, violence has significantly declined. Yes, by a large majority. Unemployment has fallen. Yes. Northern Ireland has drawn in significant external investment. Positive, yes. Less sectarian crime is reported now. Yes. It is safer to move between communities. Yes. People socialize more across the identity/constitutional divide. Yes. So these are all really real positives. And this is what people actually think. The two negatives, politicians have moved beyond the divisions of the past. 65.8% overall didn't agree. The politics of Northern Ireland remains sectarian. 71.8% of unionists agreed, alas, the politics remains sectarian. 71.7% of nationalists, 80.3% of neither unionists nor nationalists. The number of people in Northern Ireland, according to this, who actively believe that politics do not remain sectarian is 7.2%. So it's a mixed message, it's a mixed picture. There are many positives, but also much continuing work. And I think, as was said, peace processes never really end. And if I could add finally, well, Jonathan said he has 26 lessons, and Sergio had 10. I did think of an 11th lesson, which I think which Bertie Ahern refers to more than once, which is if in a peace process you can disinvent social media, you are, especially maybe that Elon Musk is now in charge of Twitter, you can help yourselves a great deal. But Bertie Ahern has seriously said more than once that if we had had the social media ecosystem now exists at the time of these negotiations, life would have been much more complicated than it even was already. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Rory. And Niall.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to hear all the different contributions. I want to apologize for not being there in person, but unfortunately, an encounter with COVID last week has kept me indoors. I want to speak more about the Irish diaspora and the role that the diaspora had in the Irish peace process. And I think it's one that's often underestimated and misunderstood. But I think it was a very powerful part of what occurred and which helped bring the peace process to culmination. As you all know, from the time of the Irish famine, about 1 million Irish left Ireland and came to America. And they brought with them, frankly, a great hatred and dislike of what the British government had done. And they became a very important and vocal force in America throughout the 1920s. You see President Eamon de Valera arriving in America, getting a massive reception from the diaspora, but never really achieving anything, being refused meetings with the American president and senior figures because the overwhelming relationship between Britain and the United States was the key element as far as the US government was concerned. And that was pretty much the outlook right through for decades. And it began to change basically in the 1990s when we went through the brief period where the Cold War was effectively suspended, and there was opportunities arising that wouldn't have arisen if the Cold War at that time was still in full flight. I came to America in the 1970s. I founded a number of Irish American publications, and part of our basic background was to put forward a proposal that there could be no peace process in Ireland without the help of the United States. And that was a reasonably controversial position at the time, because neither the Irish government nor the British government particularly wanted to have the United States involved in any way in the peace process. But our thinking was that the sides in Ireland had become so incontrovertibly locked together that there was a need for an outside force, in this case, Irish America or America, to come forward and try and help break the deadlock, so that within the box, this pattern where every action had an equal and opposite reaction on the unionist side, an atrocity would occur, then one would occur on the IRA side, everyone would be shocked and upset, and nothing would be achieved. And our theory was something very different could be achieved if America was involved and forced all the political parties to face a different reality. Now, we had a tremendous amount of success as an Irish American community coming together politically on the issue of illegal immigration. There was a tremendous amount of Irish undocumented who came to America in the 1990s and before that in the 1980s, who were basically fleeing unemployment and hard economic times in Ireland. And we worked very hard on their behalf to get legislation through the US Congress and succeeded in getting two bills, the Morrison bill and the Donnelly visa bill, which took care of about 80 to 90,000 of the Irish undocumented. And in the process of achieving that success, we learned something very important, that there was A, no votes in the British government position on Northern Ireland, and B, Irish America could prove a very powerful vehicle in bringing things forward on the issue of Northern Ireland, because Americans would listen to them. And it was with that in mind that I started a group which became involved in looking at the situation from America, from the view of the Irish diaspora, as to what could be achieved in Northern Ireland. And I made my first visit over to Northern Ireland in the mid-80s, met with Gerry Adams, met with Ulster Loyalist leaders, met with Ulster Unionist leaders, etc., and discovered that there was a tremendous need and a tremendous belief, particularly on the Sinn Féin side, because that's who we were seen as being favorable to, that their view was that an American intervention would be hugely significant indeed, significant enough to change the whole basic outline of the struggles at the time. The other thing that had happened in the meantime, which people often overlook, was the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland, which had a huge ramification in America and brought forward a tremendous amount of Irish Americans who basically were shocked to the core of their being that in the modern era that 10 young Irishmen would starve themselves to death and that it would be allowed to happen without anyone intervening. And so that brought about the conditions that Irish America became involved in a different way, not at the official level, but at the unofficial level. And I put together a group of people who formed an ad hoc group to see what could happen if Irish America became involved. A number of the people were very different to what most people thought of as Irish Americans, who most people believed were people who waved a green flag on St. Patrick's Day, drank Guinness, and shouted up the IRA at the first opportunity. We put together a group that included Chuck Feeney, who was one of the greatest philanthropists in the history of American philanthropy, the person that Bill Gates gives credit for the Giving While Living program to. He gave away, and he's extremely well known in Ireland, he gave away about $3 billion in Ireland and gave away the rest of his fortune and began the Giving While Living. There was a guy like him, the guy like Bill Flynn, who was the chairman of one of America's largest insurance companies. There was a guy called Tom Moran, who was also a very prominent businessman. We had a labor union leader, and we spent time going to Belfast, and we had a major meeting with Sinn Féin in Belfast and with the community in West Belfast. And what we found was a profound need and a profound interest and a longing for an intervention from America that wouldn't be about saying you have to stop the violence before we'll do anything for you, but that would just get involved in trying to find a way forward, that their lives could be better, that their position. And I always remember one particular woman saying to me at a very crowded meeting in the Falls Road when we spoke at it, where she said to me, "Thank you for not treating us like animals," which was an example of how demonized the nationalist neighborhoods had become. And on the other side, we went to the Shankill Road. We met with Gary McMichael, David Irvine, a number of loyalist readers or leaders rather, and we found out they had the very same sense of being outside, being kept outside, being uncared for, needing American friendship and American outreach. We came back to America with the idea of becoming involved, and we took a look at the presidential candidates based on our experience, which we had on the immigration issue. George Bush was president. He had as much interest in Ireland as he had in Timbuktu. But there was a young candidate from Arkansas that I went down to meet, and he will tell you this, and he has written this, that it was the first time that he was approached on the Irish issue was when we met with Bill Clinton in Little Rock, Arkansas, and said to him that we felt that if he were elected president, that based on our understanding of the meetings we had in Belfast and elsewhere, that there was enormous interest in American involvement, and it could become a major political victory for him. And we were absolutely astounded by his response, having had generations of where American politicians would not get involved. Bill Clinton just turned and said, "You know, one of my most important years was in Oxford, right at the end of the Irish civil rights movement." And he specifically instanced Bernadette Devlin, talked about her influence and how he looked at the growth of the Irish civil rights movement as very similar to what happened in America. And I remember leaving that meeting with Paul O'Dwyer, who is one of the great figures of Irish America. And he said to me, "If this man gets involved as president, everything will change, everything." And that was a prophetic statement, because a few months later, Bill Clinton was elected president, and we became involved with his administration, mainly through Nancy Soderberg, who became Deputy National Security Advisor, who had been Ted Kennedy's person on Ireland and was very influential within the American political scene as the Clinton person who dealt with Ireland. We went back to Sinn Féin and we said to them, "We believe we have enough impetus within the White House that if you do something for us, and what we're asking for is that we will come and visit Northern Ireland, and during our visit that you will hold a 7-day ceasefire unannounced, but one that will send a very powerful message back to the United States that you are interested in having the United States involved in a peace process." They agreed to that. And there was one hiccup where we tried to set up a visit and it fell through at the last minute. But eventually we got a visit together, and we came over and we met with Sinn Féin and we met with the unionist groups. I'll always remember my first meeting with David Trimble. He actually clicked his heels when I met him. And I thought, what a very strange thing for someone to do. But as Rory said, he more than made up for his strange personality with his political bravery. But what arose out of that meeting was a belief that we could win favor from Sinn Féin because they looked on Irish America far more favorably than they did on any other outside force. And we said to them that our view was if they gave us the 7-day unannounced ceasefire, that we could come back to them with a proposal that would try and change the fundamental dynamic of how they were being treated. And our proposal was that the American government would give Gerry Adams a visa. That was viewed with particular anger and general sense of total misapprehension from people thinking that this is an utterly impossible gesture. There's no way in the world that the President of the United States will allow an international terrorist into America. And one of our great gifts, which I know Jonathan wasn't part of, because I really honor and respect what he did in terms of the peace process and what Tony Blair did, was with the arrogance of the British, they never saw the Irish American lobby coming at them, doing what we were doing with Gerry Adams, which was working furiously with the Clinton administration to ensure that if Gerry Adams came to America, was given a visa, that the entire dynamic of the potential for an IRA ceasefire would change. And it was a very protracted battle. We had great friends. We convinced Senator Kennedy to agree with the view that a visa for Adams would be very, very important. And on the 2nd of February, 1994, the world changed a little bit for the better when the United States government allowed Gerry Adams, a quote unquote international terrorist, to come into the United States. And the impact of that was enormous, but the hidden impact was on the IRA themselves, because at this point I was acting as intermediary between the White House and Sinn Féin, basically Gerry Adams. And I was in that role for almost 3 years. So I was in between Adams talking to me. I would talk to Ted Kennedy, who would talk to the White House, who would talk to Nancy Soderberg. And the outline was that having got the visa, that the IRA would then declare a ceasefire. It didn't work out exactly like that. And there were certainly massive hiccups along the way. And I'll always remember one particular hiccup when the IRA decided to flex their muscle and fire some kind of missiles or have some kind of missiles found at Heathrow Airport, which caused an enormous amount of problems for us, because the White House, I remember Tony Legg, then the National Security Advisor, bawling me out for about 20 minutes as to what they were doing and what a dreadful mistake the administration had made, that they were aiding terrorism, and they looked really terrible. And I had to explain to him in an almost topsy-turvy way that the fact that the IRA had put the missiles in Heathrow Airport actually meant they were in favor of a ceasefire, and they were trying to show their strength before the ceasefire could actually happen. And
Niall?
actually, in fairness to them, the Clinton administration accepted that. And we worked very hard with the Clinton administration to ensuring that Sinn Féin would basically be confident in advising the IRA that if they called a ceasefire, that the United States would become a major part of the subsequent political negotiations that we hoped would happen.
Niall?
It's obviously a very intense time, but what worked out in the end was one very strange incident happened, that the Sinn Féin wanted $1 million for US headquarters where they could run a political office out of Washington. And the problem was, because of the timetable with the IRA and the negotiations, they needed the $1 million within 48 hours, the $1 million guarantee. And I didn't know anyone with $1 million except Chuck Feeney, who many of you will know is a heroic figure in Ireland anyway. And I said to Chuck, can you give me $1 million? And he just looked at me and he said, yeah, I can do that. And that $1 million basically, I think, saved the IRA ceasefire in the context of delivering one of the 3 deliverables: the Irish government, the British government, and the US government, and obviously, most of all, perhaps John Hume, to side with Sinn Féin and to accept the bona fides of the IRA if they went ahead and accepted the ceasefire, which they did. And on the 31st of August, 2 weeks before that, I had been called by a senior Republican figure and told to take my vacation in Dublin on the 31st of August,
Hi,
1994.
Neil. If we could just ask for your final remarks here. Thank you.
Sorry?
Just for your final word. So we'll move forward with the program.
Oh, yeah, sorry, excuse
Thank
me.
you.
I'll finish up. My apologies. So bottom line is, on August 31st, 1994, in a Dublin hotel, I heard the incredible words that the IRA had called a ceasefire. I knew right then that this was the end of this phase of the Troubles and that an enormous potential existed. And obviously, one other thing that America did was we put forward the idea of a special envoy, and that special envoy became George Mitchell. So that, in very much encapsulation, I'm sorry if I went on, it was the role of the Irish in America in securing the peace process in Northern Ireland. Sorry again, and thank you very much.
Neil, thank you very much for your comments. And I'd like to open up now for questions from the audience. Well, I will ask one then, because I know there's a number of students sitting here who dream that one day they could be negotiators. How does one become a negotiator? What sort of training does one need? And I'll put that first to Sergio.
Well, I'm the worst example you could pick because I'm not even a diplomat by training. So I just think it's just as much engagement with the real world as you can. In our case, everything I actually did in my whole professional life was related to the Colombian conflict. So try and understand that as best you can. And I also think that this is a big discussion, but in the end, most people who are interested in these things are not going to end up being, strictly speaking, negotiators unless they join a government, they're in the State Department, but they can help facilitate things and join organizations like Jonathan's or like the one I'm affiliated with. And there, it's actually quite important to understand what a useful role is, and to not think you're actually. I have a personal campaign against the concept of mediation, because I think that it just puts too much weight on the role of the person who's mediating, where actually you want the responsibility to be with the actual negotiators, and what you actually do is facilitate. And there are a lot of things you can actually do to help and facilitate. So I hope you all become great facilitators if you don't join a government or an insurgency.
So Jonathan, did they send you on a course? How did you become a negotiator?
No, I never did a course. When I joined the British Foreign Office in 1979, we had one day of training, which was, they gave us a book by a very famous Harold Nicholson that was first published in 1936 and republished in 1946 with the introduction saying rather modestly, a number of events have changed in the world since I first wrote this book. And a copy of a protocol on how to do placement and dinner parties. That was our training for being negotiators. Then I spent pretty much all my Foreign Office career negotiating with the Chinese on Hong Kong, 2+4 negotiations on Germany. But there isn't a career track for people who want to do that. But what I think is important is what Sergio said, that there is, increasingly in negotiations, you don't have classic mediation. You don't actually have a George Mitchell figure sitting there. It's much more complicated than that. And there are lots of different bits to a negotiation. Some of my colleagues who work in the NGO world think about this as we're doing this negotiation. That's not how it works. There are lots of different small bits. Neil was just illustrating the Irish-American role in Northern Ireland peace. There are lots of different roles that can be played. So if one is committed to doing this, there's always a way you can find an opportunity to do it. And secondly, I'd say that having always been rather skeptical about the theory of negotiation as a practitioner, I've become, particularly under the influence of Rory over the years, more of a fan of the notion you can actually learn something in general about negotiation that can be useful in these experiences, not just, you don't just have to learn the hard way by doing it. I wish I had had more than my thing on placement dinner parties when I started being a diplomat, it would have been extremely useful. So I would be very much in favor of more of a focus on the theory.
I remember being, my training was even more intense than Jonathan's. I learned the difference between a letter and a minute having no salutation. And I also was warned about the evils of drink, or the attractiveness of drink to the diplomat. So those were the 2 bits of training that I recall. No, look, a number of things from the government point of view. First of all, it was luck chance in my case. I spent 2 years in Chicago where I first met Jonathan. In fact, when he was the first secretary in the British Embassy in Washington, I met Niall as well at that time. But when I came back to Dublin in 1993, I could have been sent anywhere. And I just happened to be sent to the Anglo-Irish division at what turned out to be an absolutely pivotal time. And I went along for the ride afterwards. I suppose I was a middle ranking, quite a lot younger than I am today. I learned a great deal from observing others. I mean, I had fantastic bosses, Sean O'Higgin, Dermot Gallagher, other David Donahue, David Cooney, people like that. And I learned from them. And I think one of the things about the Department of Foreign Affairs is that in 1969, we, the Irish government, realized we knew basically nothing about Northern Ireland. So a cadre was established, mostly in the Department of Foreign Affairs, but also in the Department of the Taoiseach. And essentially the baton has been passed, the torch has been passed from one generation to the next. Fergal's the current head of what is now called the Ireland, United Kingdom and Americas division, and he will pass the torch on this summer, and so it goes. But I suppose I will say that learning from others and observation, and of course negotiation is not always a peace process. When I was Perm Rep in Brussels, ambassador to the EU is a non-stop series of negotiations, and some of the techniques I learned would have been very important at that time. And what Sergio said about two things: deeply immersing yourself in the substance, knowing the technicalities as well as the broad issues, and then secondly, making a real effort to understand where people to whom you might find personally unsympathetic are coming from, and that's really important as well. But no courses, I'm afraid, until about 8 years after I had left Northern Ireland behind me.
So we've got some hands up now. I'm going to go over there. First question.
Writing down these different pieces, I could think of being a volunteer teacher in kindergarten with Junior Achievement in New York, and each of these kids believe that. And I realized with different volunteer work at different ages, each day we could try these skills out with each other, with our professors, with volunteer work, to develop our own negotiating, I guess, plan or skill until we could have opportunities. Would you agree that that would be one of the ways to hone our skills, join councils, and just do it on a day-to-day basis until it's second nature?
Thank you. I'm going to take the 2 other hands were up. Gentleman at the back. And the gentleman in the pink shirt.
Thank you very much for the interesting conversation and this process in Colombia. My question is, during the negotiations, you were only talking to one of the guerrillas in our country, sadly, knowing that probably could not dispute the consequences just because it's another big guerrilla. So my question is, how does it shape the negotiation process, and what do you see as the next step to end the war with the ELN? Like, is there going to be another peace negotiation? Hopefully, do you think that's the way, or how can we actually have the proper?
And the final question has been submitted online from Daniela. who goes, what's the main difference between a negotiator, being a negotiator in a conflict in which your own country is a party, and to being a negotiator, facilitator in conflicts in other places in the world? So Rory, do you want to be the first to respond?
Well, yes. Well, I have, unlike Jonathan and Sergio, I have no particular, direct experience of being involved in other countries. I was the political director in the Department of Foreign Affairs, so in charge of sort of overall foreign security policy issues, and I would have followed a lot of other peace processes. And I do remember, in fact, at the request of the then EU presidency, drawing up a paper about the decommissioning process in Ireland. This was potentially of relevance, it seemed at the time, to the Middle East peace process, but then Hamas got elected and the things were cut off. I mean, I think I'd say two things. I'd say that you are probably, much more deeply immersed in the substance in your own country. At the same time, you bring your own, I suppose, prejudices and biases and personal experiences. It's less easy to be objective. I would have thought. But I think at the same time, that should, I suppose, and I don't know if Jonathan and Sergio would agree, a degree of modesty about just how much you do understand what's going on in the countries you're in. So as you bring the advantages of objectivity and perspective, and you bring maybe the disadvantage of not being quite so tuned in to all of the subtle signals and the unspoken and subterranean currents. That's my guess.
Jonathan?
I'll leave the LN question to Sergio, but in terms of negotiating with primary school teachers, pupils or each other, yes, I do think Biluri's latest book was called Negotiating with Yourself. And clearly there are lessons that you can learn from very personal negotiations. I myself have never tried to use any skills I have on my wife or children because I know they would fail. But there is a continuum in negotiation, but there are also great differences. For example, hostage negotiators use very different skills from the sort of skills that we use. There are parallels, but they're also very different. So I think that, as I say, I'm a convert to the idea there is a theory of negotiation and things worth learning, even though it is true that all conflicts are very different and all peace processes are very different, but there is something about negotiating itself which is worth learning. In terms of the insider mediators, as they're called, I think that there are sort of swings and roundabouts on that. I often myself think that ignorance is a great virtue when you go into some of these, because look at it this way, a lot of these conflicts end up with agreements that people who are expert in them will tell you couldn't possibly work and have already been in previous agreements. The point about Sunningdale for slow learners is that the elements in Sunningdale on power sharing are very similar to the elements of the Good Friday Agreement. They just went the whole way through. If you become like a real expert in a particular negotiation, you can see all the problems and you never find a way of seeing the solution. So having someone from outside who can actually say, well, have you thought of this or have you thought of that, is quite useful. As an insider mediator, which is what essentially the British and Irish governments were in Northern Ireland after George Mitchell passed on the baton, that is a rather different thing because then you have power. If you are a government, you can change things economically, in security terms, and therefore you can be a much more effective mediator. And we were jointly, effectively mediating between Sinn Féin and the Unionists on the crucial points. And I think that is a much more powerful thing than some Norwegian or other person brought in to mediate in different circumstances where all they can do is use the power of their chairmanship rather than the real power of government. So I think there is a role for insider mediators. I think it's slightly exaggerated at the moment. I think you need external vision and expertise and lessons learned as well as the internal skills. Okay.
And final word for Sergio.
I actually, with the previous question about learning to negotiate, I actually forgot to mention that I did a very good course in 2008-9 when I was Deputy Minister of Defense, and I was the lead negotiator with the State Department on an agreement, a new security agreement between Colombia and the US. And the State Department had this professional negotiator who would do the most amazing things, would sort of bang the table, stand up. At first I said, what is it? And then I learned to be very serene and calm And this was actually very useful when dealing with the FARC later on. But on the question of Afro-Colombians, first of all, Afro-Colombians participated in lots of various fora we organized, but the most amazing thing happened at the end of the negotiation in Havana, or let's call it of the main negotiation in August of 2016, which is where we were literally about to finish. We're in this kind of compound, locked up, where we'd been living going crazy for 4.5 years. And then we were told that a delegation of Afro-Colombians and representatives of indigenous communities in Colombia were in Havana and were demanding that they had to talk to us. So they literally, think about this kind of beautiful, look like sort of somewhere in the US, in Miami in the 1950s, compound in Havana with a lake and some green hills and 1950s houses. And then this Afro-Colombians and this indigenous Colombians descend upon us. And they say, you are not going to sign this agreement without talking to us and having a special chapter, what is called the ethnic chapter in the agreement, taking special account of our point of view. And so we said, well, okay, look, you've got 36 hours, but we'll do it. And so they were all in one room, and we talked to them literally, and that produced the ethnic chapter of the agreement. And they've been, especially the Afro-Colombians, been just fabulous partners in all of this. And a very good friend of mine became one of the Afro-Colombian members of a very well-known victim, one of the commissioners of the Truth Commission, and they play an amazing role. On the question of the ELN, well, the fact is we actually tried to negotiate with the ELN in parallel, but we probably made, among a number of mistakes, the mistake to think that the kind of model that we had with the FARC was going to work with the ELN. Very, very different organization. Frankly, much smaller, but that actually makes them in some ways more difficult, because they do suffer from the famous phenomenon of the younger brother who thinks he's not getting his due. And but there's now an opportunity. There's now an opportunity with a new government. In the case of the ELN, I think you really need not so much a negotiation as a strategy that includes a negotiation, but you actually need to do many more things on the ground. And I actually do think that if the peace agreement had been implemented correctly in the areas where the ELN is present, then we would have had a much better chance of integrating the ELN, because the peace agreement was agreement to end the conflict. It wasn't an agreement for the FARC, it was for everyone. Let me just one quick 10-second last word, Emma, that I want to say, building on something that Jonathan said, because we're sitting here and we're talking about lessons learned, and we talk about cases, and we talk about strategies and tactics and mechanisms. But in the end, none of this happens if the people at the top don't take the risks and don't lead. That's it. So you can have all the bright ideas you want, but it all depends on the courage and the leadership of your presidents or prime ministers, which is, I think, what happened in Northern Ireland with Tony Blair, and in the Republic with Bertie Ahern, and clearly in Colombia with President Santos, who, he got his recognition, he got his Nobel Peace Prize, but he also paid a very large price because a part of society did not understand the process and went against the process because the opposition president. So personally, he actually paid quite a heavy price that is not seen abroad. But if he had not made the decision, and he had not pushed and insisted and supported everything we were doing, nothing would have happened. And if we now think, fast forward where we're now, with this, like so many people, I frankly can't even sleep thinking about the Ukraine. It's just the most serious thing I've ever seen. And you think, well, with the permission of our dear UN friends, where the hell is the UN? Where is the leadership? Where is the effort to try and open the channels that might actually allow for a solution? Because nobody in Moscow or in Ukraine or in Kyiv can pay the price at the moment of seeming to too keen to negotiate. Somebody has to do this, and it's all about leadership.
Well, that was a great way to kick off this whole conference. So please join me in thanking our panelists.